Welcome to University College London. It gives me great pleasure to welcome Caroline Bressey from Geography and from UCL's Equianas.
Thank you, Nathaniel. So I've got some quite text-heavy slides, and I'm sorry that people at the back, I don't think you're going to be able to read them all. But I'll try and sort of indicate a bit what they say for people at the back of the room. So as the title of my talk suggests, I won't be putting in race in inverted commas the whole way through, but I want to talk about some of the work that I do, some of the slow empirical work that Keith referred to earlier, looking at the black presence in 19th century London. I particularly started my work looking at black women, but I'm branching out to look at black men now. But one of the things that I wanted to talk about a little bit today is methods and thinking about how we do this kind of work. Because I guess one of the things that's starting to come up is how unstable race is, and the fact that in many ways it's not a very helpful category, but also how we think about it as social scientists or scientists trying to unpack the kind of work when we're doing it. And if you are a historian or a historical geographer of the Victorian period, you might think you'd have a whole load of stuff to look at, such as the census, such as the huge amount of sort of bureaucratic paperwork that the Victorians pulled together. And indeed, to a degree, that's true. But although we had the discussion about the French state that doesn't collect statistics on ethnicity, it wasn't until 1991 that those of us that fill out the England and Wales census put in an ethnic identity into our census returns. And the 19th century censuses don't have a reference to race/ethnicity. No, that's a problematic way to think about those things in the census as we have it. So there's never going to be a way of extracting the kind of the exact demography of the black presence in Britain in the 19th century. And that goes for kind of all sort of ethnic groups. So we start with a kind of an interesting political problem when we're thinking about the history of multicultural Britain, in the fact that it's, how do we do this slow empirical work that is needed to illustrate the fact that that there was a multicultural London, particularly is what I focus on. So the digital revolution definitely plays a role in being able to undertake some of this work. The fact that the census is now online to those who can access it. There are obviously issues of financial access that we might want to think about at some point. But I just wanted to give you some examples of how this can work. So although race is not a category as such that you will find in the census or in birth certificates or marriage certificates, sometimes it is inscribed in people's details, not systematically, but it can be found. So you can do things like I do on a Sunday afternoon and trawl through the digital newspapers or digital things. The Times 1881 census is one that's freely available. And so that's one that quite a lot of people do some work on. But these are just some examples that I wanted to highlight to illustrate how complicated it is to find racial identifiers, if that's what we want to think about them. And even when we find them, are they that much use to us? So at the top, an example, most of them are from London, of Mary Lipscomb, a woman born in Jamaica in about 1839, living in Bromley Street. Okay, she's born in Jamaica, but that doesn't tell us if she's a Creole woman, a white Jamaican, a black Jamaican, an Asian or Chinese Jamaican, as we heard in reference to indentured labour. So not particularly helpful, and particularly although the place of birth is recorded in the census, particularly for people like me who are very interested in people who are born in Britain, that's not particularly helpful either. So then we have someone like Mary Ashley, who's born in London about 1853, and in her occupation, so this has come up by me putting Negro into the occupation box and searching for that, she's designated a professional Negro singer-musician. So it's possible that she's a black woman who's described as a Negro, but it's also possible that she's a white woman who worked as a Negro singer-musician. Now, it's interesting to think that that was a specific enough of an occupation that it gets noted down, but I think there's still enough uncertainty that I wouldn't describe Mary Ashley as a black woman. And I think that's probably the same for Annie Albury underneath, born in Brighton, living in Brighton, who's down as a nigger minstrel musician. Now, is this an illustration of someone who's more likely to be black and racialized in a more racist way by the person who was recording the information, or is it just the way that it's been put down? Again, I think very difficult to know. I'd say it's only Mary no surname given, born in Africa, naturalised British subject, working as a servant in Wavertree in Lancashire, a domestic servant and named as an emancipated slave. Probably the only person that I'd be confident out of that list as describing as someone who was black. So I had to find a different way into the archives, and as a result, what I've done is use racialised ways of identifying blackness, which are exactly the same as the worst kind of people that we've heard being talked about today. So I go through institutional records, such as the asylum records for Coney Hatch Asylum, which was a pauper asylum in London in the 19th century, looking for photographic information that will show me, allow me to see the ethnicity, the colour of the skin of people in the asylum. And although it's an incredibly problematic methodology, and we might want to pick up on that later, it does tell me things that I wouldn't find out otherwise, because I would bet that if anyone went through the census and found the names Caroline Maisley and Mary Matthews, they wouldn't assume that they were black women. Why would you? They're not known as particularly black names, and certainly Mary's got her surname from her husband, James. And in the medical records of their admission to the asylum, there's no reference to the colour of their skin at all either. Partly because when it came to insanity, the Victorians weren't particularly interested, or the Victorians in Britain weren't particularly interested in race as a form of insanity. They were particularly interested in the relationship in families and whether insanity was hereditary. So it does note that these two women are sisters, but it doesn't note the colour of their skin. It's only through having the photographs that we can know that. But one of the other things that digitisation has allowed is for a ream of 19th century newspapers to be trawled through with search names such as Negro, coloured servant, coloured nurse. And I'm just going to run through these quite quickly. And they're just sort of examples of the kind of things that you can find. Wanted, a coloured barmaid to be trusted and take charge of the house, one who can speak English preferred, but someone who's also trustworthy. Someone's advertising for someone to do that in the Liverpool Mercury in 1881. A number of coloured barmaids, which with my colleague James Neal, who's interested in the politics of drink, we're quite interested in investigating the nature of the coloured barmaid. But in these references to women who identify themselves as black, as I might call it, but usually women of colour, it's interesting to think why people did that. An advertisement in the newspaper costs money. Each word costs money. Why do you spend your valuable money highlighting the fact that you are a person of colour? Is it because you're concerned that you might not get an interview? Is it for particular sympathy from particular groups of people? Or is it that you can afford to do it and thus make sure that you don't get a door slammed in your face when you turn up for work? But apart from those kind of what we might consider very, very small personal stories, we get a little bit of a bigger story, perhaps. So these two examples, one, the bottom of a nurse who was advertising to get a job with a family specifically going to Australia. She advertised herself as a middle-aged coloured woman, not seasick, obviously important. And then at the top, a coloured man who'd just come back from Australia in the Western Mail. This was in Wales. And this got me thinking about black people and their mobility, black people in Britain who are moving to Australia. And would it be possible to consider their encounters with another kind of blackness, that of Aboriginal people? So I did a little bit of work in Australia where they have their newspapers digitised, not behind a firewall, but freely available. And I did the same kind of work looking for coloured people who might have been advertising themselves for work. And you find interesting similar things coming up, that you do have coloured men and coloured women advertising themselves for work to do kind of general domestic work all across Australia. But also you start again to get into some of the kind of politics of labour and the politics of identity that we might think about. So this woman here at the top, a young coloured woman, a splendid nurse, speaks English and French, low wages. Why would you highlight that you would take low wages, presumably lower wages than other people that might be looking for work? How does that play into things like the politics of white Australia that we know will be coming in a couple of decades' time? Or for this coloured man who with many years long service and first class references, white Australia is just on the door. Did the idea of his being a man of colour affect his ability to get work in this kind of new white Australia world? But then equally, who were these coloured people? Were they black British people? Were they African Americans, who I did find in the archives? It seems unlikely they were ever Aboriginal people, because they do tend to be identified differently, it would seem, but something definitely to think about. So you get this is just a sense that there are a number of different ways of getting access into this. And so in just the last minute or so, I've given you what you've seen, a little transcriptions of like a tiny, tiny reference here. So each time you can see, hopefully you could just see a sort of an emphasized letter. That's an indication that it's the start of a new advert. They're tiny, tiny things, not repeated very often. And probably there are many people that didn't highlight the manner of the colour of their skin, and equally these are people that could afford to put in adverts. There would have been clearly lots of people who working in domestic service who couldn't afford to do that at all. So but there's a sense, moving on, this last one here, coming back to the talk we had earlier, thinking about the creolisation of the Caribbean, perhaps, as a good cook, someone looking for work as a cook, someone who can, to a degree, dictate their terms. She'll only work whether someone with a kitchen maid, describing herself not as white, not just as West Indian, but as a light-coloured West Indian. And perhaps as we move into the Edwardian period, the war, the race riots that are coming in 1919, we get a sense that colour is being inscribed more and more strictly and more problematically onto people's bodies. So I just wanted to finish saying something actually about Katherine MP, just in my last 30 seconds. He is the other side of the work that I do, which is thinking about anti-racism and how Victorians are trying to fight the kind of the racialisation that it's coming. And in light of some of the things that we've been talking about, I'll only say that Katherine MP, who was born in Street in Somerset, where she lived her whole life, and had a journal called Anti-Caste, as it says in the title, which she called Anti-Caste because she didn't want to call it anti-race, because as soon as you use the word race or races, you re-implied difference that it was almost impossible to overcome. That she used phrases such as so-called, that she placed the word white in inverted commas when she used it, and she saw race as a social construction. And she was publishing her journal in the 1880s. So the fact that we're still having the same kind of conversations is testimony to how powerful race is as a theoretical idea and how difficult it is to dismantle it. Thank you.